The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to AWCI's online learning series. Today's presentation is Suicide Prevention in Construction. I'm Tao Wen, AWCI's Education Program Manager. So before we get started, a few housekeeping items. One, all attendees should be on mute during today's presentation. Should you have questions at any time during today's broadcast, please submit it using the question box in your GoToWebinar dashboard. We will have a brief Q&A at the end of our presentation as well, and we'll make every attempt to get to all of your questions. And lastly, handouts for today's webinars can be downloaded from the Handouts tab in your GoToWebinar dashboard. So I'd like to introduce today's panelist, Ed Hanley, a co-chair of AWCI's Safety Directors Committee. Ed is also the Director of Safety for the Raymond Group. He is responsible for developing and implementing all elements of Raymond's safety program so as to maintain a safe and healthy work environment in both field and office operations. Ed has over 25 years of experience in the industry overseeing safety operations. So welcome, Ed. I'd like to turn it over to Ed, who will introduce our presenter.
Thank you, Tao. I appreciate it, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining our quarterly webinar. And in the spirit of bringing awareness to suicide prevention and the Suicide Prevention Month, I'd like to welcome Stuart Binstock, President and CEO of CFMA, and Stuart also has over 25 years of experience in the construction industry, and it's going to provide us a great presentation today on suicide prevention. So I'll turn it over to Stuart. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ed. Hi, everybody. I go back a long time with AWCI. Knew Steve Etkin very well. I understand Mike Stark is now the CEO. Mike, I think, also comes from AGC, where I was initially started my career in the construction industry. And the guy who kind of put me together with you all is Pete Cheney, who's I believe, a consultant to you all. Pete and I spent a lot of time at AGC together. I would encourage all of you, stay away from the basketball court if Pete's on it, because he's got some big elbows and is a tough son of a gun. So I have real fond memories of spending some time at lunchtime on the basketball court with Pete Cheney. He's quite a guy, both on the court and off. September is Suicide Prevention Month. And for many of you, you may not think this is a important topic, a topic that impacts your company. But I like to tell a couple of stories when I start off on this topic. When we got involved in this initiative about 6 or 7 years ago, I was talking to a very prominent electrical contractor, a union electrical contractor. And I told them what we were doing in the area of suicide prevention. His eyes kind of bugged out at me, and he looked at me and he said, "How'd you hear about us?" I said, "I have no idea what you're talking about." He said, "We lost 3 people to suicide in the last 18 months. The last one was a foreman who hung himself in the boiler room of a Fortune 100 company." This was the president of the company I was talking to. He said, "I had to go out to the Fortune 100 company and explain how we could continue to operate and perform on the site where this happened." And then they got sued by the spouse of the person who died by suicide. The second story I'll tell you is I was asked to talk to the safety directors of the 50 largest construction companies in the United States, the Kiewits, the Granites, Bechtel, Sunt, a long list of very prominent companies. I am a lawyer by training, and you're always taught never to ask a question you don't know the answer to, but I violated that credo. And I asked them at the very beginning of my presentation, this was about 3 years ago, and I said, how many of you know of someone who's died by suicide in your company? And about 60% of them raised their hands. I guess those are all a prelude for me to explain to you that, goodness, I hope this has not hit your company yet, but it's a very real issue. And it's a very real issue in the construction industry, in which we'll talk about as I move along. I will say I want to compliment AWCI that Ed Hanley is kind of the spokesperson for this. I've given the industry a bit of a rough time over the last few years because really this all started through our organization, CFMA, Construction Financial Management Association. And I always like to say, how did a bunch of accountants end up leading the charge on suicide prevention? We led the charge because there was a vacuum and we filled it. There was nobody talking about this issue. This is a safety and a risk management issue. And I'm very pleased to see how the safety folks in the construction industry have now embraced this topic and understand its impact on their companies. The Construction Management Association of America asked me to speak a year or two ago, and I thought it was an interesting presentation. It was called A New Definition of Safety. I talked about suicide prevention. A iron worker, a female iron worker, talked about bullying on the job site. And a female project manager, a minority female project manager, talked about discrimination on the workplace. I don't think those are things we normally think about from a safety perspective, but they can have an impact on safety. Let's make sure I can follow. Let's see. There we go. Speaking of a small minor panic, I thought my slides weren't going to progress, but they have. So here we go. This is what we're going to talk about today, the next 40 to 45 minutes. Why do we need to address mental health and suicide in the workplace? I've kind of already alluded to some of the reasons. Some of the reasons are it's very real. This is not a made-up topic. How can mental health and suicide be woven into your existing safety, wellness, and performance practices? How does this integrate with bringing additional employees into the workforce? I think that's a very interesting question, which we'll touch on, which I don't think people really think about. How can you measure your company's suicide prevention preparedness and culture? And what resources are available through the Construction Industry Alliance for Suicide Prevention? That is the organization CFMA created along with some others in the industry about 6 or 7 years ago to bring the entire industry together to talk about this issue. So the first problem that we have when discussing this topic is that we don't have a mental health or suicide problem. I don't think it's intentional that people say that. Frankly, it's out of ignorance. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, we have a listserv we call our Connection Cafe. Somebody posted one of our members posted something which addresses this issue. She basically said, what's this all about suicide prevention? I see this splashed all over the website. I see all sorts of emails I'm getting about suicide prevention. What's all the fuss about suicide prevention? This this is not a topic important to the construction industry. Well, as a member, I had to gently, and I mean gently, suggest that she was mistaken. So I posted a response. And I explained that, no, indeed, this actually is a very large problem. And I pointed out some of the things I'll be talking about in my presentation today. But then it's almost as if we had planned it or planted it. A barrage of emails came in suggesting that this woman did not know what she was talking about, and she needed to address this as a very serious problem in her company and in the industry. And by the end of all those flurry of emails, she wrote back and said, I'm talking to my HR department, and we're looking at ways in which to train our employees. So the reality is, it is a problem. And, you know, we talk about suicide prevention. Suicide, unfortunately, is the final result of mostly what is mental health problems. And I think we're far more attuned to the mental health problems going on today. Unfortunately, one of the byproducts of the pandemic was problems with mental health, serious issues that people have with mental health. And so that has highlighted the need, I believe, to talk about this issue in greater detail. So here's some of the data which leads us to understand how serious a problem this is. We go back to 2018, there were 1,008 construction worker fatalities. I believe OSHA calls it the fatal four. There were a total of 1,008 construction worker fatalities. That same year, they estimate there were over 5,000 worker suicides. The suicide rate in 2018 was 5 times greater than construction worker fatalities. I don't believe those numbers have changed in any significant fashion. That's the most recent data that we've been able to cull together. But I'd like to think that maybe we've had an impact on some of this by some of the work we've been doing, but I'm not sure we're there yet. I know we're not there in terms of really making substantial headway. So this is some more up-to-date data. 46,000 deaths by suicide in 2020. I believe that's in the United States. It's 130 per day. I think one of the interesting or really important pieces of information to look at on this slide is 112 lives are impacted by each suicide. Think back on that story I told at the outset where the superintendent hung himself in the boiler room. Think about the impact of that suicide on that company. Think about the people that were working on the job site. Think about the whole company. So that 112 lives impacted by each suicide that's a low number compared to what happened to that company. And this other statistic is also very telling. People are 2 times more likely to die by suicide as a survivor of a loved one who dies by suicide. Fortunately, it tends to repeat itself in families. We had a horrible incident a few years ago where someone who was very involved in our suicide prevention efforts worked for a CPA firm. His brother, I believe, had died by suicide. We found out that he had taken a leave of absence. And shockingly and incredibly to our dismay, he died by suicide 6 months later. So why is the industry suicide rate so high? Well, first of all, men 20 to 40, white men 20 to 40 account for the bulk of suicides. And obviously construction is a male-dominated industry. 97.4% of the U.S. construction workforce is male, and 57% is Caucasian. So in some respects, it's a demographic issue, but it's a little more complicated than that. And I think these are some of the issues that we see, and most people will shake their head in agreement and say, yes, I understand all of these to be true, and they all lead to mental health and ultimately suicide problems. So the first one is that stoic, tough guy culture, still, I think, ever present in the construction industry. Sharing your feelings about emotions is not high on the list of things that people in construction do. Sometimes you need to do that if you have a problem, a mental health problem. You need to talk to somebody. That notion of fearlessness, promotion of supervision without leadership training. It's kind of the old Peter principle that sometimes people who could help in this area, but haven't had the proper training. Isolation when traveling. If you're, if you've been asked, your company has a job and you're 500 miles away, and you get back every other weekend, that kind of isolation leads to some of these mental health problems. Sleep disruption, deprivation due to shift work, seasonal layoffs, furloughs have an impact on a family and can have an impact on that individual as well. It tends to have a tolerant culture for alcohol and substance abuse. We'll talk about opioids in a second. It's the industry with the highest use of prescription opioids. That has a big impact. And of course, that's all related to chronic pain. People get injured probably more on construction job sites than any other workplace. And that chronic pain leads to being given opioids, leads to addiction, and ultimately sometimes leads to suicide. There's performance pressures. This is a job with a lot of pressure. And then finally, there is a gun culture within much of the industry. So you have access to lethal means. If you had all of these things but didn't have access to lethal means, then there might be a lower number. But if you add all these things up together, they are a unfortunate but good explanation why the industry has such a high suicide rate. But the good news is there's hope. Suicide is preventable, and there are programs in place. There is a lot of work that has been done over the last 6 years to address this issue in the construction industry, and I will try and devote most of my remaining time to talk about the hope and the possibilities of turning this around. As I said a couple minutes ago, I made a link between mental health and suicide. 46% of people who die by suicide have a known mental health condition. That's a very telling statistic, and here's some more statistics that are very daunting. Unresolved depression contributes to a loss of $210 billion a year in absenteeism, reduced productivity, medical costs. So you're talking about before you get to this horrible result of suicide, just depression, substance use disorder, all of these things lead to a significant cost on a company. We made a decision a while ago that talking about suicide prevention is the right thing to do. But the reality is, even if you don't feel that way, if as a company you don't feel it's the right thing to do, there are business reasons why you need to address this issue. And that may sound a little harsh, but I think we're trying to realize and appeal to people that take away whatever kind of, if you think there's some kind of do-gooder mentality here. No, this is about your business. This is about the negative impact on your business. You know, when we first got involved in this, once again, people ask, why did a bunch of accountants get involved in this? Well, our response to that was, you know, what is a construction company's most important resource? Well, it's its people. And if it's people, if you can do something to help protect your people, make them more productive, eliminate some of the negatives that reduce their ability to perform, then you're actually doing something very responsible, fiscally responsible on behalf of your company. So we realize that the people are the most important resource in your company, and you need to protect your people. Some of the other statistics here: 1 in 5 adults experience mental illness. Talks about substance abuse. 40% of injured workers felt depressed after 1 month. But here's the positive: a $1 investment in mental health results in a $4 return on your investment. Investing in this pays and is a benefit to your company. So let's talk about opioids, because this is a huge problem, not only in the construction industry, but certainly at large. So, and the reason why it's such a serious issue in construction is this first bullet: injured workers in all industries receive powerful prescription pain medication. And this is an industry where you probably get injured more often than any other industry. As it says, construction workers have one of the highest injury rates compared to other industries, making them more likely to be prescribed opioids. Construction workers also rely on their bodies and often feel the need to overcome pain in order to work and get paid. So the long-term use of opioids leads to increased sensitivity, increased risk of depression, increased risk of suicide. The risk of opioid addiction and misuse duration. So if you take opioids for 1 day, you have a 6% chance of still using the drug a year later. Look what happens if you've taken it for a month. You have a 29.9% chance of still taking the drug a year later. Let me just stop and I want to quote some statistics I found in a September 5th ENR article. One of the things that we've been able to do is get other folks in the industry to get on the bandwagon and talk about suicide prevention. The publisher of ENR, Scott Seltz, has personally taken it upon his mission to talk about this issue. Last year, I think it was the first time they had an article. It was actually the lead article and the cover story was on suicide prevention. This article I'm referring to is about opioid addiction, which was just 2 or 3 weeks ago, was the lead article in Engineering News Record. And I really have to applaud Engineering News Record. They have given us free space to advertise now for 2 or 3 years now. You'll see one-page ads for the Construction Industry Alliance for Suicide Prevention every other month in Engineering News Records magazine. So let me just quote a couple of things from this article. Construction workers have the highest rate of death from overdose. 55% of construction workers receive opioid prescriptions when going to a doctor for pain, the second highest in any industry. 6 times more likely to become addicted or die from opioid use than workers in other industries. 6 times. 8% of surgical patients who were not opioid users before, who became opioid users following surgery. And about $9,000, the average amount employers spend annually per worker with an untreated substance use disorder. I would say that number sounds incredibly low, and I would suggest it's probably much higher. So one of the other kind of misconceptions or mistakes I think the industry has made is we're focused on other employee recruitment and wellness initiatives. So we haven't really focused on this as an industry-wide issue. But I would suggest to you that this may be one of your most important recruitment and retention things to consider. Let me be very frank. Who's going to want to work in an industry that they find out it has the highest suicide rate of any industry in the United States? I mean, let's be candid. You need to focus on this to encourage an already severe shortage of skilled workers to find a place in construction. At CFMA, we do a quarterly, what we call our Confindex survey. It's a survey of our members. We ask them about a bunch of different issues, ask them what's concerning them this quarter. You won't be surprised because it's consistent with the rest of the industry, but worker skill shortages is the #1 issue every quarter. The last quarter, I believe, 85% of our respondents said they were either very or highly concerned about skilled worker shortages. It's generally about 4 to 5 times higher than any other single issue that we ask them about. So we have a severe skill shortage. You all know that. And then we have a statistic about having some of the highest suicide rates of any industry. You need to address this as an issue in your company. You need to let people know that you're thinking about them and you care about them. But one of the problems we often have is people will say this: we don't know how to get started. And that's where the Construction Industry Alliance comes into play. CIASP was born out of necessity. Once we saw the Center for Disease Control did a study, as I said, about 6 or 7 years ago. What happened with us is a prominent member and a expert in suicide prevention sent us an article on suicide prevention about 6 or 7 years ago. And the editor of our magazine came in to me and she said, we just got this article on suicide prevention. What do I do about this? Should we publish this? Well, if you know anything about CFMA, our members are CFOs of companies across the industry. And then there are folks who want to work for CFOs. So there are people like bankers, sureties, CPA firms. That's our membership. Talking about suicide prevention was not on our radar. We talk about succession planning. We talk about tax planning in our magazine. We don't talk about suicide prevention. We decided, she looked at me, I looked at her, we said, let's print it and see what happens. And I always say we had no idea the tsunami of activity that would take place after printing that article. People came out of the woodwork and we heard stories over and over and over again about how suicide had impacted people personally and their companies. So out of all of that was born CIASP. We realized that CFMA was not going to be able to do this alone. We held some organizational meetings. I believe AWCI may have been involved at the front end of those meetings. And so we established in 2016 this entity. And we always talk about shattering the stigma surrounding mental health issues. And CISP became a standalone organization in 2018. I want to address this word stigma because I thought it was fascinating. I was just traveling. I was in Chicago and I was watching the TV, and all of a sudden an ad came up, and it was by the Indianapolis Colts, the football team. And it was talking about the importance of addressing mental health and removing the stigma. I thought, wow, we have come a long way from where we could not hear anyone talk about it to now a professional football team is talking about it as a major issue. So that's where this was all born out of. CIASP is dedicated to educating and equipping organizations to stand up for suicide prevention. And I think this is a very important point to understand. We're not going to make folks in the construction industry experts in suicide prevention. Much of what we try to do is raise awareness. So your supervisor should understand the warning signs of someone who might be contemplating suicide. We'll talk about that in a second. But I will also tell you one thing I am most proud of is that CIASP brings together union companies, merit shop companies to fight this common cause. CFMA is agnostic on that issue, but we have the past chair, just the first chair of CISP was from CFMA. The second one was from ABC, and now the current chair is from the building trades. And I think that's significant. I think there are other issues where the industry has not been able to come together as an entire industry. This issue impacts the entire industry. And I'm very pleased that we've been able to carry that forward and remain kind of agnostic on some of the issues that impact the industry otherwise. And I'm trying to advance the slide and nothing is happening. There we go. Just in case you didn't already figure this out, technology is not my master, so I panic when things like that happen. So here's some things to think about. Getting help. Encourage your company to put posters up showing the National Suicide Prevention Line, so that people have, if people need to talk to somebody, these are readily available. A lot of companies will put these up in their break room. And then learn to recognize the warning signs. So these are generally the warning signs that may help you determine if somebody is struggling with this issue. One of the interesting things about suicide prevention that I have learned is, and I think I talk about it in another slide down the line a little bit. But I never thought, you would ask someone, are you contemplating suicide? My thought was maybe that would make them think about doing something they hadn't thought about. But in fact, the experts say that you should actually directly ask somebody if they are contemplating suicide. That's kind of counterintuitive in my mind. So that's one important piece of information maybe you hopefully will get out of this presentation. So here's some of the warning signs. Feeling sad or depressed, sleeping too much or too little, talk about feeling trapped, feeling anxious, mood swings, withdrawing from family and friends, increased use of alcohol or drugs, talking about being a burden to others, decreased self-confidence and feeling hopeless and helpless. You're only going to find these out by talking to somebody and seeing if they're feeling some of these things. So some of the signs specific to construction are decreased productivity. If you see somebody getting into more arguments than normal with other coworkers, maybe a near hit, incident, or injury on the job site, their cognitive abilities seem to be reduced, decreased problem solving, and increased tardiness and absenteeism. There's no simple formula to say, oh, this person is contemplating suicide. It's complicated, and there are a series of things that you might want to look at. So one of the training tools that we have on the CISP website, if you look it up, it teaches supervisors to TASC, Tune in when you notice or sense someone needs help. Focus your attention on them. Ask, here's the point I made a second ago, ask them if they're thinking about suicide clearly, directly, and calmly. State that suicide is serious and connecting them is important, and connect them to a person, a helping resource. I've also been told by experts in this field that once you find someone who has told you that, yes, they are contemplating suicide, you need to stay with them until they connect with someone or a resource that they can talk to or see. You don't want to leave somebody alone who has thoughts like this in their mind. So once again, on the website, the CISP website, which you can Google CIASP, but I believe we have a link to it. You'll see it in a second. Is a needs analysis and implementation tool to help companies evaluate how they address mental health and suicide. It will help you determine how prepared you are to handle a mental health issue or a suicide crisis. So it is a series of questions you answer best of your ability, and it will spit out the data on maybe where there's some weaknesses in some of the training that you have, or if you don't have any training at all, it's probably going to suggest that you do some training. But I encourage every company to find this on the CIASP website and take a look at it and fill it out. Take the time to see where you fit in terms of your preparation for something like this. I hope the stories I told at the outset should make you realize that any amount of work you do in advance will pay extraordinary dividends in terms of being able to address the problem and hopefully maybe even prevent some suicides. So get informed, understand why this is the most at-risk industry for suicide. We've talked about that. There is training on the website called Living Works. It's an online training program that teaches people what to look for and how to connect. And then you can take a brief anonymous online screening to check in on your own behavioral health, connect to local resources, and work towards recovery. There are a ton of resources on the CIASP website. We also really want people just simply get started. How do you get started? You can encourage your company to take the pledge to stand up for suicide prevention. These are actual pages on the CISP website. And you'll see that there's we want as many people to take the pledge. AWCI has taken the pledge. We ask as many associations as we can think of and find to take the pledge. CFMA obviously has taken the pledge, and I think we have probably about half of our chapters have taken the pledge, or half of our 99 chapters have taken the pledge to stand up for suicide prevention. And really there are no financial obligations to do that. There are no any obligations other than making the statement that you pledge to stand up for suicide prevention and address it as a health and safety priority. And as you'll see, by creating safe cultures, providing training, raising awareness, normalizing conversations around suicide and mental health, and ultimately decreasing the risk associated with suicide in construction. A whole series of things that we hope will happen after you've taken the pledge. You'll address it as a company, you'll provide training, you'll raise awareness. There are toolbox talks on the CISP website. So there's lots of material that you can use to get started. And integrate this into your company culture. So there are, you can get copies of the Recognize the Warning Signs you could post that in your break room. They come in small pieces of paper where you could pass those out to everybody. As I mentioned before, you could incorporate toolbox talks on psychological safety topics. These are recognize the warning signs. They're wallet cards that you can print and distribute to all of your employees. And as it says here, also hang posters that address suicide and mental health. One of the things also that a lot of companies have employee assistance programs, and you need to promote those. You need to let people know they exist, and you might have other mental health services as well that would be useful for your employees to understand and utilize. The last 3 years have obviously had a major, I guess we're at 2.5 years, had a major impact on mental health. So soon after COVID hit the United States, we started to create COVID resources as well. The mental health impact of COVID, I think, has been enormous. And people working from home, people feeling stressful about going to work at their offices. There's a whole bunch of information you'll see here about COVID resources to help you address if that's still an issue. I know we all like to think COVID's on its waning days, but I will just tell you a personal story. My nephew, his father-in-law got COVID 2 days ago and died yesterday. It's not over. So there are still things we need to address in terms of COVID and addressing the mental health anguish that it's causing as well. What else can your company do? So company can take the pledge to stand up for suicide prevention, look for the toolbox talks that are available. There's education through this Living's Works program that you can access through the website. Take 5 minutes to talk about suicide prevention during monthly meetings. And the last one, CISP is a total voluntary activity. We have really no funding other than companies that have decided to contribute to it and believe in the cause and help. So we'd love, if there's some companies online here, to donate to CISP, but that's the last thing we're asking for. We're really more interested in you accessing the resources available on the website and starting to educate your employees and make them aware of this very serious problem in the construction industry. And that concludes my remarks. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions if we have them.
Okay, thank you, Stuart. One of our attendees asked, suicide in construction has been such a big problem for quite a while now, but it appears to be worsening. So why have we been unable to significantly reduce the rate of suicides in the construction industry?
No, I'm not sure it's worsening. I think we may have better data. Maybe it suggests that there's a larger problem. It's a serious problem. And so I'm not sure we conclude that it's gotten worse. What has happened is through CIASP efforts, we have highlighted the issue more, and I think people are more sensitive to it and are aware of some of the issues now more than they ever were. I'll give you an example. I gave a speech a month or two ago, and I know when I would ask the question, how many suicides, usually in a smaller setting like I was in, nobody would raise their hand. People are much more aware of it now. And
Muted.
A group of about 45 people, 3 people raised their hand and said they had suicides in their company. So I think I'm not sure it's gotten worse. I think our awareness has improved, so we understand it more as a problem and have accepted it. I'll give you another example. I spoke at a national convention of a roofers union, and they told me, the president of the union told me after, when I got off the stage, he said, you know, we went back and looked at deaths in the industry a couple of years ago, and we realized that we were totally under-calculating the number that were suicides, that the issue was far worse than we ever understood. They were designated, the deaths were designated as something else other than suicide. But what's happened is, since all of this activity, people are much more aware of it, and therefore the reporting has improved on what's unfortunately a terrible topic to have statistics on.
Unmuted.
Another question is, so how does suicide training work, both from a corporate perspective and on a job site? And how do we make sure that the training is not only effective, but viewed as in a positive light by a workforce that traditionally has shied away from talk of emotional and mental health?
That's a good question. So as I alluded to, there's lots of training material available, and a lot of it is supervisory training. And so to make your supervisors aware of, and then you can have toolbox talks with the whole crew, talking about some of the things to look out for with one another. You know, having a buddy system is probably not a bad thing on a construction job site. Australia has a nationwide activity. It goes beyond construction, and the name of it is "Are You Okay?" And the concept is, you are supposed to walk up to your coworkers and ask them, "Are you okay?" That alone sometimes can lead people to tell you things that they might ordinarily not tell you. You know, I mentioned at the outset, this is a stoic culture. So these are not things that we generally talk about on the construction job site. So I would say, to answer some of the parts of that question, supervisory training is really important to make them kind of aware of what some of the problems are, and to highlight, let them know what the warning signs are so they can be attuned to that. And then there's also, you know, other talks to have with the entire workforce. And as I alluded to, you can have a 5-minute conversation about it. And you can do 5 minutes every month on this. And you know, people are going to shy away from wanting to talk about this. It's a difficult subject to talk about, but you have an obligation to your employees to talk to them about this. And I think the question about the effectiveness, you know, I don't know if we have any concrete empirical data to support effectiveness, but to us, I think the mantra that we've tried to encourage is awareness equals effectiveness. And just the more you can make people aware of this as a problem and keep them attuned to it and have them sensitive to their coworkers, I think you can eventually see that there will be results. And I think, you know, I also alluded to the fact that the company culture has to change a little bit. You know, that old stoic mentality, you got to back off on that a little bit in terms of when you're thinking about some of these issues. And that's where that assessment tool I mentioned for the company fits in, for you to look at what you're doing as a company, and that will help you figure out where your deficiencies are and what you might focus on.
And one last question here. When a suicide occurs, how does it impact the company's employees and the company itself? I know you touched a little bit on that earlier.
I sure did, and I think that example is a great illustration of how it impacts the company. So in that real life story I told, the company almost lost the job that they were working at on a Fortune 100 company. It was they have a recurring relationship with that Fortune 100 company, that potentially could lose that customer, which I have to assume is a very good relationship for them. The morale of the employees who are on the job site has to be horrible. The spouse sued the company, the impact, so there's a real financial impact. And then just, I know this company was based in a different locale than where the suicide took place, but when all the employees find out, well, the impact on the company as a whole, I think, was just devastating. So, and then, you know, then the person told me the story, they had 3 in the last 18 months. Well, that gets people starting to think about, is there a problem with this company? And there wasn't a problem with that company, but I think it just highlights the seriousness of the issue. But people are going to start talking about that. And then as I alluded to, then that becomes kind of a recruitment and retention issue about people finding out about this and wondering if they want to, 1, work in the construction industry, and 2, work for that company. The cost to a company, I think, can be devastating. They justify any of and all of the expense that you would put up front to prevent that from happening.
All right, and we have one more question that just came in. So this person asks, is tying apprenticeship, hazing, and suicide prevention into the same talk a good idea?
I don't think it's a bad idea. I think, you know, hazing is kind of a form of bullying. And as I alluded to, I was on a panel where female iron worker was talking about bullying and the impact on employees. Hazing is kind of akin to bullying. So yeah, I think they kind of all fit into that. And that kind of fits into the culture of your company. And what are you willing to accept from your employees, or what are you not willing to accept in terms of behavior that will adversely impact other employees? So I think my quick answer to that question would be yes, I think they do. They do. If you tie them together the way I just did, I think they do work in the same conversation.
Well, once again, thank you for your excellent presentation. And we encourage all the attendees to visit www.preventconstructionsuicide.com and take advantage of the resources available that Stuart mentioned earlier. And any time is a good time to begin the conversation about how to recognize when someone needs our help and support. So on behalf of AWCI, we would like to thank Stuart's willingness to present to our group. Thank you so much, Stuart. And thank you to all the attendees for joining us for today's webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.